Hello and welcome to a very special episode of Bible Unboxed. Today we are tackling a tricky issue in the books of Samuel. That is this question of who actually killed Goliath. It's not as clear as you might think. To help tackle this problem, I am joined today by someone who has written on this very topic, Paul Davidson of the YouTube channel Inquisitive Bible Reader. Welcome to the channel, Paul.
Thank you for having me.
You're actually the first guest I've had on the channel, so thank you very much for being here.
Wow, and this is the first time I've been a guest on a channel, so the pleasure is mine.
Look, let's jump straight into it. You have done some writing and some thinking on this topic. So what are the problems with the story of David and Goliath, and who actually killed Goliath?
Well, Lachlan, as every child is taught in Sunday school, of course, we all know that Goliath was killed by that famous hero of Israelite legend, Elhanan, who, of course, no one has actually heard of.
Yeah, it's not a name I was familiar with as a kid.
That's right. So if we back it up a little bit, everyone, of course, knows the story in 1 Samuel about David, the young shepherd boy who comes to see how his brothers are doing in battle and ends up killing the Philistine giant Goliath. But then way at the other end of Samuel, we've got this short story that occurs when David is old. He's already the king of Israel, and one of his champions, a soldier named Elhanan, kills a giant named Goliath during a battle against the Philistines. So that has, of course, famously led to all kinds of discussions about how these two stories can both be true. How do we harmonize them?
So what actually happens in the story of Elhanan?
Right. So that's in 2 Samuel 21. David has been fighting the Philistines alongside his soldiers, but he has this close call with a giant named Ishbi-Benob. So his men say, okay, David, you can't fight on the battlefield anymore. You've got to stay home. And then after that, Israel has a few more battles with Philistines, and each time there's a Philistine giant that gets killed by one of David's men. And one of those giants is Goliath, whose the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam, it says, which is, of course, the same phrase we find in the more familiar story about David. And he is killed by a warrior named Elhanan the Bethlehemite.
The shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. So that description is used for both.
So it's clearly the same Goliath, and there's clearly some kind of literary borrowing one way or the other.
If someone's borrowing from one or the other tradition, do we know which one is older? And how could we know that?
Yeah, and that happens a lot in the Bible, right? You have two similar stories, and you're not sure maybe which one is older, which one is newer. In this case, almost every scholar agrees that the David and Goliath story is the more recent story, and that the Elhanan story must be the older one. There's a number of reasons. One is that the David story simply has more problems. There's a lot of doublets, repeated material, contradictions that show up if you look really closely. And it seems like that version was being edited and rewritten at quite a late date. And it varies a lot between different manuscripts, especially between the Greek and the Hebrew. A second reason to consider the David story later is that it would be very unusual to take a story about a famous person like David and then apply it to some nobody that no one has ever heard of, like Elhanan. It would be a lot easier to take this story about an unknown soldier and apply it to your favorite hero and say, well, actually, this guy David that we all like, he must have done it because, it was a great heroic act.
Yeah, it would be a bit strange if, the original story was David and Goliath and then some random little hero gets to borrow that. But sure. Yeah, I can see how it would work.
Yeah, it's not impossible it went the other day, but you'll find almost no scholar that thinks it's the other way around.
You were talking there about some of the problems in the David and Goliath story, so some doublets and little contradictions.
That's right. We've kind of got these two views of David that are mixed together. First, he's the youngest son of Jesse with three older brothers who go to battle while David stays behind, and he does the shepherding. But there's this other story where he's already working in the household of King Saul. And then, so when David arrives on the battlefield, Saul should already know who he is, but Saul doesn't, and he asks, what does he ask? Abner? Who is that young man who just, killed Goliath because he has no idea who David is? We've also got things like, does Goliath die by having his head cut off, or does David kill him with the stones? Goliath's death seems to happen twice in that story. So there's a lot of, almost every beat in the story has a copy somewhere, and you can kind of separate them out into two stories that might have been combined, or maybe it was just expanded. Exactly how it happened, you'll find a lot of different views.
I also notice at the end of the story, when they go back and everyone's sort of praising them, I think the women of the town come out and they say, Saul killed his thousands, David killed his 10,000s. No one mentions the fact that David killed Goliath, which seems a little strange, don't you think?
That's right. That is a good point. And it's possible that there was this generic battle story to which Goliath was added later. That's another view that some people take. And maybe the story got spiced up. Add the giant, add David's sling, and make the story more interesting.
The description of Goliath and his weapons, it's quite Greek, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And the description of him is a lot more detailed in the David story. So he's got like a spear, a javelin. He's got the bronze greaves. And a lot of scholars look at this and say, well, this is basically what a Homeric warrior or a Greek hoplite wore. And so it could be inspired by the Greek mercenaries that were in the Middle East at that time, or simply have been inspired by Greek mythology. It's hard to say.
And I was reading too, the very idea of having like a contest of champions where the two warriors come out, sort of like the movie Troy with Brad Pitt. Like that idea is very Homeric, like from the Iliad. It's not really something that's ever found again in the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah, sort of two warriors meeting on the field of battle and having a sort of a contest. That's right. It's a pretty unusual thing to see in the Bible.
And so I guess those sort of things that they would sort of indicate perhaps a bit of a later editing of the story, wouldn't they? Because Greek ideas coming into the Hebrew Bible, that is a little bit later than
That's
the
right.
monarchy.
It would have to be pretty much post-exilic, dating to the time when Greek influence was already widespread in Palestine.
What are some of the similarities then between the two stories of Elhanan and David?
Yeah, obviously the giant is the big one. The giant in the ring is Goliath of Gath. How many giants named Goliath of Gath can there be, right? And then the second one, as we already mentioned, is that the description of his main weapon, a spear like a weaver's beam, is very distinctive. What are the odds that two different stories would describe a weapon that way? And some scholars point out that actually the David and Goliath story doesn't only take into account the Elhanan one, but the details of the other giant, Ishbi-Benob, whose spear weighed 300 shekels of bronze. That seems to be reflected in Goliath's spear, which weighs 600 shekels of iron. So they're kind of upping the stakes a little bit. He's like Ishbi-Benob, but even bigger and stronger and heavier. And then there's this other giant in the Elhanan story who has 6 fingers and toes on each hand and foot. And so this sort of this weird physical aberration is also reflected in Goliath's unusual height, right? 7 feet or 9 feet, depending on which manuscript you read.
Yeah, can you talk a little more about that? How tall was Goliath, depending on which version of the story?
Oh, right. So if you read a typical English Bible, I think it'll say 9 feet, because the Hebrew Masoretic text says 6 cubits in a span, and that's sort of what it works out to.
And that's like typically like that's what you would expect of a giant,
Yeah, so that's like, fantasy book giant, right? Like you're looking way up at him. But the older manuscripts, like the Septuagint and I think now the Dead Sea Scrolls, say 4 cubits in a span, which would make him 6'9". How do you tell the height in Australia?
6'9". Well, I'm going to Google it because I'm not very good at the empirical system. That'd be 205 centimeters, I think.
I'm Canadian, so we still use feet and inches for that.
So that, I mean, that's like an NBA player, right? Like,
Yeah, it's tall, but it's not freakishly tall. And in fact, King Saul himself was said to be head and shoulders above the other men in height. So King Saul is practically the same height as Goliath, if you take that into account.
and the Greek text, the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls, scholars believe that preserves the older height.
Yeah, that just makes sense, right? Not only are those manuscripts older, but which is more likely? Are people going to exaggerate the height of Goliath over the years, or are they going to play it down? Yeah, the bigger he is, the more impressive the feat and the more interesting the story.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I noticed was that the NIV translation, when you go read about the story of Elhanan, the NIV reads that Elhanan killed the brother of Goliath. So what's going on there?
I have a bit of a bone with the NIV. They tend
doesn't?
to do this a lot. Oh, it is the most popular translation in evangelical churches, of course, rivaling only the King James Version. Yeah, so stepping back from that, if you look at these, most of the stories in Samuel are found in some version in Chronicles, right? And so if you look at the Elhanan story in 1 Chronicles 20, it says that Elhanan killed Lami, the brother of Goliath the Gittite, or Goliath of Gath. And so you kind of like, okay, what's going on there? How come they've invented this brother that isn't in Samuel? And so, if you want to harmonize these texts, you can say, well, obviously the chronicler is right. Samuel made a mistake. So Goliath had a brother. And the NIV sort of took that as license to change Samuel to say Elhanan killed Goliath's brother. But actually, the chronicler tended to also sort of fudge the story when he wanted to adjust something that he didn't agree with in Kings or Samuel. So here he took the word Bet-Lami, which means the Bethlehemite, and he changed it to Et-Lami, which almost looks the same, but it means Lami plus the direct object marker. And Lami is kind of a made-up name. Like there's no one else that was ever named Lami. And then he changed Et Goliath, which was Goliath plus the direct object marker, to be the very similar looking Ahi Goliath, which means brother of Goliath. So by tweaking two letters, the chronicler kind of made the text say brother of Goliath with this new character Lami in it. When scholars look at that, it's pretty certain that the Samuel version is correct and that there was no brother of Goliath in the oldest version of the story. So in my view, anyways, the NIV has just sort of copied what the chronicler did and reused it in Samuel.
Right, so they're trying to resolve the difficulty the same way that the chronicler has done, but in the Samuel text, not the Chronicles text.
That's right. Of course, my view is that you should let both texts say what they want to say, even if they don't say the same thing.
Yeah, so just to be clear, in Hebrew, in the later Samuel narrative, Elhanan and Goliath is Goliath. He's not the brother of Goliath.
That's right.
One of the questions I have is, it makes total sense that David the author of Samuel has borrowed this story from Elhanan, an editor has put it in and given it to David. But then why preserve the second battle? Why preserve the story of Elhanan? He's relegated to this secondary little epilogue at the end of the book.
There's a few ways to look at it. One is that the Bible actually does this all the time. They have multiple versions of the same tradition or very similar traditions that seem to contradict, and they didn't mind putting those all in together because their approach to history was very different than ours, where we want a set of facts that all agree with each other, whereas they were working with traditions that they wanted to preserve even if they seemed to contradict. And view of Graham Auld, who you probably know is one of the most famous scholars of Samuel and Kings, he sort of takes this view that the older parts of Samuel are the end, and they came from a separate work that we don't have anymore that he calls the Book of Two Houses. And then the earlier parts of Samuel, the detailed stories of David that are kind of the most fun, were sort of added on to flesh out the story and explain how all the dry stuff happened. And so in his view, the book of the two houses, which had the serious facts like Elhanan killing Goliath, was just too important for the scribes to leave out. So they had to include that. And then even when they added on the new story of David killing Goliath, they just felt it all needed to be kept together.
Right, so it was a tradition that was obviously important to people, communities, whilst these books were being put together and edited.
Yeah.
And so the author, editor has preserved the secondary narrative.
I think so. And the Elhanan story is part of this bigger set of tales about David's elite warriors, the Shalishim, or the 30. And there's other passages where they list like every single name of them, and Elhanan's on that list too. So I think certainly to some editors, this part was just too important to cut out. So there are a few sort of fringe theories we could mention, like some people
I love a good fringe theory.
what if Elhanan and David were the same person? Wink, wink.
I have heard that. So why do people think that David and Elhanan could have been once originally the same person?
Yeah, well, it was pretty common, of course, for kings to take a throne name once they became king. So every king kind of had two names. And David isn't really a name, is it? It's the Hebrew word for beloved, I believe. So you could say, well, maybe he was born Elhanan and he became David when he became king. And the fact that Elhanan's father's name is kind of weird and might be corrupted has led some to suggest, well, maybe his father's name was just Jesse, and they messed it up somehow. And an even less common proposal is that there were either two Goliaths, or that Goliath was some kind of title and not his name. So then there was two, they each killed their own Goliath.
So Goliath kind of being then like a type of giant. So
that's right.
Wasn't the word, they didn't have a word giant. It was a Goliath.
Yeah, and there's, I think, one commentary that takes that approach. But yeah, that's pretty unusual. I don't think many people agree with either of those proposals.
Yeah, I think it's difficult for me to see how an author would include both of them if Elhanan and David were the same name. Because, I mean, in the second story, Elhanan essentially works for David, like as an employee. Yeah.
And David has just been sidelined in that story. So no matter what, you still got a contradiction that you have to deal with.
And obviously the description of the two Goliaths, I mean, both being Philistines, both having the same spear, it's a bit of a bit of a stretch to say, well, it was just a type. Every giant walked around, from the same place and had the same weapons. Like, and
I'm Goliath now.
Yeah. One thing I find interesting too is there's a bit of an interesting connection, isn't there, between Elhanan's name and the weaver's beam, the spear like a weaver's beam that we find, isn't there?
Yeah. So I went on a rabbit trail trying to figure out what a weaver's beam is before this video.
I'll bring up a picture for the viewers.
so let's say you know nothing about weaving, and you hear the story of David and Goliath, and it's like Goliath's spear was like the shaft of a weaver's beam, and you think, wow, that must have been something really big. Like the author is thinking, what kind of simile can I use? A ferryman's oar? No, that's not big enough. I know, a weaver's beam. But actually, a weaver's beam was apparently a thing they call a heddle rod. And when you have a loom and you have a frame that holds the strings in place, you have this little rod that you pull up and down to alternate which strings are above the others. I guess the warp, and then you pass the sideways strings in between. I'm explaining this very poorly. And that's how you make cloth. And the heddle rod is not this enormous device that you could use as a huge spear. It's actually a small rod that, a woman or a child can manipulate. So it's a very strange way to describe the giant's spear. But when we look at the Elhanan story, Elhanan's father is, let me just bring it up here. Maybe you can tell me, what was his father's name?
Elhanan, the son of Jair Oragim.
That's right. Famous Jair Oragim. So this name, Jair Oragim, means basically the forest of weavers. So there's obviously something fishy going on here. Is what are the odds that Goliath has a weaver's beam for weapon fighting the son of a man whose name is Weaver or Forced of Weavers? And sort of the typical explanation is that some kind of typo found its way in, and the author accidentally copied the word weaver in a second time and garbled the name. But an alternate explanation is that Elhanan was a weaver, and that this weird weapon was originally his weapon, because there's this interesting article, I'm just going to bring it up here, by Edo Garfinkel, I believe. And he notes that there's a whole bunch of warriors in the Old Testament or people that kill enemies of Israel with unusual makeshift weapons. So like Samson's got his famous jawbone of the donkey. David has his sling, of course. Shamgar had his ox goad. And whenever you find this pattern, it's always the hero's weapon that is singled out for some reason. So Goliath is kind of the one exception. Why would you single out Goliath's weapon and not Elhanan's? And maybe the reason is because originally it was Elhanan's weapon. He was a weaver. He took this little rod off his loom and he killed a giant with it, which is actually kind of a good story.
Just like an improvised weapon.
Yeah, an improvised weapon, just like the ox goad, just like the donkey's jawbone. And you're like, wow, he didn't even need a sword to do that. That makes him a better warrior, not a worse one, right?
Yeah, and it fits totally with some of the other stories that you read.
Yeah, exactly. That's pure speculation, but it's an interesting possibility, I think. The other explanation that you'll often get is that originally it was the shape of the weapon reminded people of, what's it called? There was a Greek and Roman weapon called an amentum that was like a javelin with a rope tied around it. And it looks vaguely like a heddle rod for a loom. So some have argued that, well, maybe Goliath was a Greek hoplite warrior, like we've already discussed, and he had this unusual Greek weapon with leather straps on it. And the narrator didn't know how to describe it, so he said, oh, it's like a weaver's shaft. So that's a possibility as well. I like the other idea, but you pay your money and you make your choice.
Yeah, oh, look, I'm all on board. It was Elhanan's weapon. That's what I want to go with.
Okay, we've decided that's the answer.
Yeah. Which one we prefer more, yeah. Yeah, because it is odd, isn't it? A weaver's beam, it's not particularly long, and it's not particularly thick. I mean, I think 5 centimeters, which I guess, it's not like spindly, but it's certainly not this impressive weapon that you would imagine a giant to be wielding. So what I'm basically picking up is that there was this original story of Elhanan and Goliath, and then as the story of David develops, and David is obviously the much more important figure for Israel, an editor has given him the legendary tale of Elhanan and Goliath, given that to David, mixed in some Greek ideas in there as well. And then the Elhanan account has been preserved in, I guess, what is essentially a footnote to the book of Samuel, because it was obviously still an important tradition in the minds of the Israelites at that time. And then obviously the book of Chronicles comes along and tries to reconcile what they understand to be a textual difficulty. Is that about sum it up?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of understanding it that makes sense of all the different parts that seem to contradict. And I mean, that's what we're trying to do at the end of the day is try to understand how the text that we're reading got the way it is. Obviously, not everyone's going to like that. The David story is better, so it'd be nice if that was the true story. But we also have to acknowledge that no matter what, there is literary creativity going on in these stories. For example, there's lots of speeches in the David and Goliath story, and ancient authors didn't, stand there with notebooks transcribing speeches. They made up speeches that fit the characters they were writing about, even if those were historical characters and historical events. So there's always creative output in these stories that isn't, what we would consider to be 100% historical.
And you're right, because I mean, the Elhanan story, it's literally 1.5 verses. Like it's tiny, and then the David and Goliath story like spans over a couple of chapters, and so obviously they haven't just ripped off another story. There's been a a creative literary working there.
For sure. And maybe the Elhanan story was originally longer and we don't get the whole thing. That's probably the case, and it's kind of a shame.
Yeah, justice for Elhanan. That's
right.
That's the hashtag justice for Elhanan.
Remember Elhanan.
Yeah. He got the raw end of the deal. But hey, look, at least, he gets a little tiny bit. They didn't kick him out for good.
That's right. Hey, he had no idea people would be writing blog articles about him 3,000 years later. But no one's going to ever make a movie about Elhanan, will they?
I mean, I think they should. Absolutely. No, Elhanan, it is essentially like walking into the Hollywood casting office and then they say, well, sorry, mate, we have we've given it to Brad Pitt.
we rewrote the script, right? We've got a better script now. We've changed a few things. You're not in it.
Yeah. Here's your last paycheck. There's the door.
Yeah.
No, that's been really helpful. And hopefully you watching at home have found it helpful. Perhaps you've never thought about the fact that there was 2 stories of David and Goliath. But Paul, where can people find you and your writings and your videos?
Well, I've got a blog called Is That in the Bible? IsThatInTheBible.wordpress.com.
Yeah, that'll be in the description. And you were telling me that's how old is that now?
Okay, so I started it I started in 2014, so I'm going on 8 years.
Yeah, very impressive. No, that's a great website, some great articles there. So check that link out in the description. And you've got a YouTube channel as well.
That's right. My YouTube channel is called The Inquisitive Bible Reader.
I also highly recommend that. Some great animation. On this channel, we love animation. So yes, thank you so much, Paul, for coming along. And I hope everyone comes and checks out your channel and your website.
Thank you. I had a great time.
Awesome. Well, until next time, you've all been watching Bible Unboxed.